Hey everyone, welcome to Time with the Bible Live, where we've kind of just made it our mission throughout the series of lessons to look at different stories about Jesus, his life, his ministry, his teachings, and just thinking about some application for us as we're seeking to be followers of him and trying to live out our faith as Christians, as disciples of Jesus. Today we're going to be in Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. We're going to be looking at kind of a different story. I debated whether I was wanting to add this or make this part of the study or not because it kind of doesn't talk about Jesus, but I want to show you some connections as we think about the context of the story. We've been talking a lot about John the Baptist. We talked about how he was the herald. He was the one who came to prepare the way for Jesus and declared people to make their lives and their hearts ready to receive him. But we also talked about how John the Baptist declared Jesus to be the Lamb of God. That many of Jesus's disciples were also disciples of John the Baptist. And then we talked about last week, we looked at Luke chapter 7, where John the Baptist was in prison and he's suffering, and he was about to die. And he asked a very unique question that you wouldn't think John the Baptist would ask. And that question was, "Are you sure you're the one?" And I don't know if John the Baptist was struggling as he was suffering to, because maybe he thought it was going to be different under the Messiah, or maybe he sent his disciples there because they needed to hear those things. And Jesus, instead of saying anything, he just immediately went and started healing people. And then he told them to tell John the Baptist everything that they had experienced, everything that they had seen him do. Today, we're going to look at John the Baptist and we're going to think about him being killed and the events surrounding that. Let's look at Mark chapter 6, verse 14. We're going to read down to verse 29, and we'll think about the context here later and what that has to do with what we're going to be talking about and what it has to do with Jesus, really. So in Mark chapter 6, verse 14, it says, "Now King Herod heard of him," talking about Jesus, "for his name had become well known, and he said, 'John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him.' Others said, 'It's Elijah.' And others said, it is the prophet, or like one of the prophets." But when Herod heard, he said, "This is John, whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead." For Herod had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her, because John had said to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." Therefore Herod held it against him and wanted to kill him. But she could not, for Herod found John, knowing that he was just and a holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a feast for the nobles and the high officials and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced and pleased Herod, those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, "Ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you." And he also swore to her that whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half my kingdom. And so she went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." And immediately he came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on the platter." And the king was exceedingly sorry. Yet, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. And immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head be brought. And he went and he beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl. And the girl brought his head, or gave it to her mother. And his disciples, when his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. Okay, so as we're looking at this text, look at the beginning, look at verse 14. It starts off with King Herod finding out about Jesus. Now, I want to think about the context of what's going on around here. Back in verse 7, in the same chapter, previously before this time, John the Baptist was the most known. He was more known than Jesus during this period of time. He's more known than Jesus. But at some point, Herod finds out, he hears about Jesus and everything that Jesus had been doing. And that's probably because of what's going on in the context. John is very specific in this in verse 7 that Jesus calls the 12 to himself and he sends them out two by two to go and preach about the kingdom and about himself. And they were to go and spread the message, to go into all different kinds of cities. And so he probably heard about Jesus because of the disciples going and spreading the message. And so now King Herod hears of him, that's in the context here, hears of Jesus. And what does Herod immediately think? Well, Herod immediately thinks, this is John the Baptist. It has to be John the Baptist. Um, let's think about Herod for just a minute. I think we got to know who Herod is. When we think about Herod, there's all kinds of them in the scripture. This is actually a ruling family that kind of got in good with the Romans, and was given some authority over some of the region of the regions of Judea. And so this is a family name, Herod. It's the ruling family. You probably know pretty well Herod the Great. Herod the Great was he was the one who killed the babies and tried to kill Jesus, and his parents fled to Egypt, and that's Herod the Great. He would have been the first one on the totem pole. Actually, when Herod passed away, he gave his kingdom to his sons, kind of 4 different regions to 4 different sons. And so they kind of reigned over different areas of Israel. And so Herod Antipas, which is the one that we're talking about, he's going to be the one that kills John the Baptist here. He's also going to be the one who killed I take that back. Actually, later on, Herod Agrippa the First, his nephew, is going to be the one who kills James in Acts chapter 12, who imprisons Peter. But he's Herod Antipas, the one that we're talking about here in the story. He's going to be the one who actually Jesus will be sent to later on in his trial, sent to by Pilate during the trial. So later on, this Herod will understand that this is not John the Baptist, but this is indeed Jesus, a different person. So we also have Herod Agrippa the First. That was his nephew, and he killed James. But also you have Felix and Agrippa. They're also part of the Herod family. Those are his sons. But think about what's going on here. What is Herod thinking when he hears about Jesus? He immediately thinks that Jesus is John the Baptist, resurrected from the dead, and he's coming back with power. That's why he's able to do all of these things. And he's thinking that clearly, if he's coming back in power, that means he's gonna overpower his enemies, and him being the first, because he has this guilty conscience towards something that he did. He hears about Jesus. The first thing he says, "Oh, it's got to be John." And even when other people said, well, it could be Elijah, talking about Malachi's prophecy of one coming in the spirit of Elijah. And some say, well, it's got to be him. It's got to be Elijah. Others were saying, no, it's one of the prophets. It's got to be just another prophet. But when Herod is talking with these people and they're suggesting all these things, he says, no, it's John the Baptist. It has to be John the Baptist. You can kind of imagine how he's feeling in all of this. And obviously, by the time Jesus is on trial, he doesn't think that it's still John the Baptist. He knows that it's Jesus. But we're kind of given a backstory to better help us understand why he thinks that. What is it that would cause this king, this ruler, to think that this is John the Baptist? Why is he so afraid? Well, we're given more of the story, the flashback. Because Herod had arrested John and put John in prison. And because Herod had married his brother's wife, John had told Herod that it wasn't lawful for him to be married to this woman. Understand something, that Herod had been previously married. He was married to a woman by the name of, I don't know if I can say it right, but Fassel, who is the daughter of the king Ardis, who was a king of a border nation, a nation east of the Jordan. And because of an affair that he had with his brother's wife, Herodias, this horrible woman, Herodias. And so really, Herod had broken the Jewish law about marriage and divorce in two different ways. Number one, because of the adulterous relationship that happened. And number two, because he was marrying his brother's wife while his brother was still married. And so two different ways he had broke the law, the Jewish law. In fact, if you go back over to Mark chapter 1, I'm going to show you something. In Mark chapter 1, verse 4, we have about the ministry of John the Baptist. In verse 4, it says, John came baptizing in the wilderness and preaching a baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. And then all the land of Judea and those from Jerusalem went out to him and were baptized by him in the Jordan River, confessing their sins. John the Baptist was this righteous preacher who was preaching about the sins of the people, and people were confessing those sins, and they were repenting of them, and they were being baptized to wash them away, in a sense, for the remission of their sins. And obviously, John's baptism is different than the baptism that we have today. Our baptism has meaning that the John's baptism could not. Death, burial, and resurrection that we are united together with. And as at Acts 19, when those were baptized by John, heard about the baptism of Jesus and who the Messiah was, they were rebaptized. But John's baptism was the will of God, as we saw over in Luke chapter 7. But they all came confessing their sins because John was preaching about the sins of the people. And I'll tell you something amazing about John is that he wasn't going to hold it back, not for anybody, not even Herod the king. That he would preach that he didn't have any right to be with the woman that he was with Herodias. And when you start preaching boldly enough to preach about the sins of the ruling people, you put your life on the line. You put your neck on the line. Literally, John did. But he preached him the truth in hopes that even a man like King Herod would repent of his sins. He did not hold back. I'll tell you something. That's something for us today. We shouldn't hold back either. We ought to preach the truth to people. Tell people what they need to hear. And John the Baptist is a great example of that. He was a bold preacher. And look how Herod felt about John. He loved John. See, I think Herod knew that John was right. Now, King Herod didn't have any intentions in repenting or making any changes. Maybe he enjoyed listening to John. He enjoyed listening to him. But look how Herodias thought about John. She hated him. She wanted to kill him. But King Herod would not do that. Herod would not do that. Like, he knew he was a holy man, and so he ended up protecting him from Herodias. And one of the ways he protected him was by putting him in prison. But we see in the text, but Herodias' daughter. Herod had this wedding banquet that was going on, and Herodias' daughter came in. This was a party with live entertainment. She came in, and she had all the nobles and the high officials and the chief men there. Herodias' daughter ends up dancing. That's his stepdaughter. which is not good. None of this is good. Um, Having this live entertainment, having your stepdaughter showing herself off. This was probably a sensual dance. It says she pleased Herod. I'm assuming that there's a lack of innocence in all of this, and he offers her anything she wants, even up to half of his kingdom, which is really ironic because he's a king without a kingdom. He doesn't really own anything. He's just a tetrarch, which is like just a ruler. By the way, the fact that Mark calls him King Herod, it's kind of there's a lot of irony there. He is a king without a kingdom, and that's just what the Jews called him out of tradition. But he wasn't given that designation by the Roman Empire at all, which would have been really important for him. But he was never given the designation. He didn't own the kingdom. And if she had asked for half of his kingdom, I don't know what he would have done. I'm not sure quite what he would have done then. But there's just nothing good about this whole situation. Herod is not thinking this through. Herod's probably drunk. But she ends up going back to her mom and asking, what should I ask him for? And Herodias just has this incredible hate within her. Think about all the things that this young woman could have asked for. Ask for a nice house, ask for all kinds of different things that she could have requested. But what does she ask for? What does her mom suggest? Because she has this hatred for John the Baptist. She just can't stand John the Baptist. She wants him dead so much. She ends up asking for his head on a platter. And so Herodias' daughter goes back and asks for his head on the platter. And notice what it says, that the king was exceedingly sorry. He didn't want to give her that. He really, really regretted offering what he offered her. But because of the oaths that he made and all of his ruler, all of the high people that were in the room at the time, all of his ruling people there, he sends for John the Baptist's head, and it was given to her. I say what, there's just all kinds of things that are not good about this. I think I heard a lesson one time, and it was entitled "Sins That Beheaded John." Like, John was such an incredible man. As we read before, Jesus said there was none more righteous than John the Baptist. He was greater than all the prophets. He was the mouthpiece of God. He was the herald to prepare the way for Jesus. But just think about all the sins that would be included in all of this. Sensuality, the dancing that was done at the party by Herodias' daughter, his stepdaughter, the adultery that took place between him and Herodias, maybe drunkenness that probably led to a very rash vow that was made. I think that once he realized what kind of a rash vow, we're told that we're to keep our vows, that if we're going to vow something, that we ought to keep it. But I think with it being such a rash vow, when he realized what he said, and that what she was requesting was not right, he should have had the courage to not keep the vow that he made. You think about the hatred. You think about the bitterness, everything that was stored up within Herodias because of John the Baptist. Think about the pride and the lack of courage. He should have broke the vow. He should have had the courage to break the vow. Making a rash vow, that's another sin. You shouldn't make rash vows like that. And there's all kinds of things that we might kind of add in that. And so you might ask, well, what does this have to do with Jesus? And I want to think about that for a minute. Previously, as we saw back in verse 7, Jesus had sent out the 12 to go and preach about the kingdom, to preach the gospel to the people. And that's why Herod ends up hearing about Jesus. But then we have this whole thing that takes place. John the Baptist, or Herod's flashback, and Herod thinking that this is Jesus. But then as you get down to verse 30, the apostles come back from their trip, and told them everything that had happened while they were out. And notice in verse 31, and he said to them, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest for a while. Can you imagine Jesus in all the work that he did and all the labor that he had been doing? There were times in Mark and just previously before this that he had so many people wanting things from him, people that needed to be healed, people who were possessed with demons, people just want to be taught. He had so many people coming out to him that he didn't even have time to eat. In fact, his family thought he was crazy and they were going to commit him. And so they were going to try to make him take care of himself. And so Jesus would have been exhausted in all of this. And then he hears about his cousin. And he hears about how they did to John what they're going to do to me. I want you to notice when John's disciples hear it, they came and took away his corpse and they laid it in a tomb. The same thing would happen later on in Mark chapter 15. As Jesus is crucified, that two of his disciples, although they were disciples in private, they became public as they took his body and laid it in a tomb. John the Baptist was executed because of his boldness, because of his courage in preaching the truth. Jesus was going to be executed because of his boldness and his courage in preaching the truth. And the same thing that they did to John was going to happen to him. And so you can imagine how heavy that would have been on Jesus's mind. And so when the apostles came back, he says, let's go take a break. Let's go off to a deserted place and find somewhere to rest for a little while. Jesus didn't take very many breaks, but he did on this occasion. At least he tried, because as they went on a boat to try to go to some place to rest, the people were following him and they came for more teaching, and Jesus gave them more teaching. But you can imagine how Jesus felt in all of that, having known what was ahead of him and what happened to his cousin. I thought that was an interesting lesson and some things to think about as we consider Jesus and his life and some of the difficult things that he was facing. Obviously, this is kind of early on in his ministry, but there will be other times in which he'll try to take a rest and he won't be given the courtesy of it. I hope that's helpful. Some things to think about. Certainly some reflective things, making sure that we don't have bitterness in our hearts, and making sure that we're not participating in sins like Herod and Herodias were. Certainly some challenging things, some good things to consider in Jesus's life, and just the compassion of Jesus. Because when these people came to him, when he was trying to have a rest, it would have been easy for Jesus to just lash out at them, but instead he had compassion on them and he taught them. Incredible lessons, incredible things for us to consider. Hope you can think about that today, kind of give you some things to meditate on throughout the rest of your day. Everybody have a great day. And oh, by the way, if you didn't catch the first part, you're always welcome to go back and watch the recording. That'll be there later on. So, but everybody have a great day and God bless.